My brother-in-law lifted his glass before the lawyer ever opened his mouth, and my sister was already crying, happy tears over the cottage keys, sitting in the middle of the table. I stood by the kitchen island in my mother's house, watching the two of them accept congratulations like the deed was already signed, and I said nothing, because that's what I always did. Then our family's lawyer cleared his throat, set his briefcase on the table, and told everyone to sit back down. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I was 34 years old the weekend. My parents called the whole family up to the cottage on Georgian Bay to settle things properly, which is the kind of phrase that means absolutely nothing until it means everything. My younger sister, Nadine, had always been the one things came easily to. Not because she didn't work. She did, in her own way, but because there was a current running through our family that pulled everything toward her without anyone admitting it was happening. When we were kids, if Nadine forgot her gym strip, my mother drove it to the school. If I forgot mine, I ran laps in my socks and figured it out. When Nadine struggled in math, my dad hired a tutor twice a week. When I struggled, I was told I'd find my own way, which I did, eventually, alone, at the kitchen table at 11 at night, with a calculator and a library textbook. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because by the time I was in my 30s, I'd stopped noticing it as unfair. It was just weather. It was just how our family functioned. The way some houses are always a little cold in the hallway, and you stop mentioning it. Because everyone who lives there has learned to keep a sweater by the door. I built a life that didn't depend on my parents noticing me. I went to Western for accounting, got my CPA designation through years of articling and night courses while working full-time, and eventually opened my own small practice in Barrie, doing books for local contractors and a couple of dental offices. It wasn't glamorous. I drove a 7-year-old Civic and lived in a one-bedroom condo with a balcony that looked at a parking garage, and I was, by any honest measure, doing fine. More than fine. I had savings. I had a TFSA I actually maxed out every year, an RRSP I didn't touch, and a habit of reading my own financial statements for fun on Sunday mornings with coffee, which my ex-boyfriend used to find unbearably boring and which I now understand was one of the great loves of my adult life. Nadine married young, to a guy named Trevor who sold commercial insurance and talked about his book of business, the way other men talk about their truck. They had 2 kids quickly, bought a house in Barrie's North End that was a little too big for their actual income, and leaned on my parents more than either of them would ever say out loud. New furnace. My parents paid half. Down payment top-up. My parents lent. It which in our family was understood by everyone except my mother to mean gave. Braces for the older kid, paid in full, no conversation. The cottage was the one constant through all of it. My grandfather, my mother's father, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Walter Hewitt, had bought the lot on Georgian Bay in 1974, back when a waterfront property up there cost about what a used car costs now, and built most of the original cabin himself over a handful of summers. By the time I was a kid, it had been added on to twice. First a screened porch, then a second bedroom wing, and it had become the place where every important thing in our family happened. Easter egg hunts in the yard. The week every August where 3 generations crammed into bunk beds and somebody always ended up sleeping on the pullout in the living room, listening to the loons. My grandfather taught me to fillet a pickerel on the dock when I was 9, standing behind me with his hands loosely over mine, saying, "Let the knife do the work, Claire Bear. Don't fight it." He died when I was 26. The cottage had been quietly assumed, by everyone, including me for a long time, to belong eventually to Nadine. Not because anyone ever said so directly, but because Nadine and Trevor were the ones who brought the grandkids up every summer, who filled the place with the kind of noise my parents said they wanted in their old age, who looked, on paper and in photographs, like the family the cottage was for. About 6 weeks before that weekend, Nadine called me while I was doing a client's HST return. "You should see what Trevor found for the dock," she said. "Composite decking, no more splinters every July. We're thinking we redo the whole thing next summer." I held the phone against my shoulder and kept typing. Rito, whose doc? The cottage doc. Obviously. She laughed. Easy, certain. I mean, once Mom and Dad actually sign it over to us. Dad's been hinting for months that this is the summer they make it official. I didn't say anything for a second too long, and she filled the silence the way she always did. Don't be weird about it, Claire. You know it makes sense. We're the ones who use it. You're, never even up there anymore. That part was true, and it stung in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time, because the reason I wasn't up there anymore had more to do with how exhausting it was to watch my own family orbit around my sister than with any lack of love for the place. But I let it go, the way I let most things go, and I said something non-committal about busy season, and we hung up. The weekend itself started the way these things always started in our family. Too much food. My mother fussing over a chair arrangement nobody else cared about, and Trevor doing a slow lap of the deck with a beer, narrating the cottage's potential to my Uncle Greg like he was already the one holding the deed. My dad had asked everyone to come up for a proper family weekend, which in retrospect should have been my first clue, because my father does not organize proper anything without a reason. Saturday evening, after dinner, my dad tapped his fork against his wine glass, and the chatter around the long pine table died down. Nadine sat up a little straighter beside Trevor, and I watched her do it, the way you watch someone settle into a seat they've been measuring for years. Your mother and I have been thinking a lot about this place, my dad said, his arm finding its way around the back of Nadine's chair. About what it means and where it should go. We want this cottage to stay exactly what it's always been, a place full of kids, full of noise, full of family. He looked at Nadine, and his voice went thick in the way it does when he's trying not to cry in front of people. Nadine, Trevor, we want you to have it. The table erupted. My mother was already wiping her eyes. Trevor clapped my father on the back like they'd just closed a deal, which, in his head, I think they had. My aunt started taking pictures. Nadine pressed both hands to her mouth, and then reached for Trevor's arm. And for one full minute, it really did look like the whole weekend, maybe the whole family, had been built around delivering her this exact moment. My dad reached into the breast pocket of his fleece vest and pulled out the spare set of cottage keys, the ones that lived on a hook by the back door my whole childhood, and pressed them into Nadine's palm. Welcome home, he said, and Nadine, my baby sister, looked down at those keys and smiled. Not a happy smile, not really, but something tighter and more satisfied, the smile of someone whose math had finally come out the way she'd been calculating it for years. She held the keys up for the camera, and Trevor put his arm around her, and somebody started clapping. And I stood near the screen door with a glass of lukewarm white wine and felt the floor of the cottage I loved more than almost anywhere on earth, quietly, politely, close itself off to me. That's when a chair scraped against the worn pine floorboards at the far end of the table. Everyone turned. My father's old friend and our family's lawyer, a soft-spoken, precise man named Daniel Okafor, who had handled my grandfather's estate 15 years earlier, and who I'd genuinely forgotten was even at the table that night, stood up slowly, setting his napkin down beside his plate. He wasn't smiling. Daniel Okafor was, in my experience, always smiling. It was practically a professional habit, and the absence of it landed in the room like a dropped glass. Daniel, my father said, his hand still resting on Nadine's shoulder. Everything all right? There's one more piece of business that needs to be addressed tonight, Daniel said, his voice even and quiet in the way that made the whole table go still. I should have brought it up before any of this happened, and for that I apologize. But it can't wait any longer. He reached down into the leather satchel by his chair and lifted out a sealed envelope. Cream-colored, a little soft at the corners with age, the kind of paper my grandfather had always kept in the roll-top desk in the cottage's back room. Across the front, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, in pencil pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, were 8 words. To be read at the cottage. Family present, no exceptions. The clapping had already stopped. Nobody was looking at the keys in Nadine's hand anymore. Everyone was looking at that envelope. My mother's face went pale in the porch light. "Daniel, what is that?" "This is a letter your father left with me," Daniel said, looking at her. "Along with a set of instructions I was asked to follow to the letter. Instructions I was specifically told not to act on until I saw, with my own eyes, that the cottage was about to be formally signed over to one family member. That happened about 90 seconds ago." My dad let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. The kind people use to push back against a feeling before they understand what the feeling is. "Daniel, come on. Walter's been gone 15 years. Whatever this is, it can wait until—" "It can't, Richard," Daniel said gently. He was very specific. He said, "If I let this moment pass without reading it, I'd be breaking the one promise he ever asked of me personally." The porch had gone fully silent except for the cicadas outside and the soft slap of water against the dock. Nadine was still holding the keys, but her knuckles had gone white around them, and Trevor had stopped narrating anything to anyone. Daniel slid a thin silver letter opener under the flap and broke the seal carefully, like he'd done it in his head 100 times already. He unfolded 3 pages of my grandfather's handwriting, cleared his throat once, and began to read. "If you're hearing this read aloud, then my family has gathered at the cottage, and someone has just been handed the keys, believing the place is theirs." A ripple went through the table. My aunt set her wine glass down without drinking from it. Daniel continued, his voice level. "I want to say first that I love every single one of my grandchildren equally and completely, and nothing in this letter is meant to suggest otherwise." Nadine's smile, which had been fading slowly since the chair scraped, came back for half a second, brittle and hopeful. "But for years now," Daniel read, "I have watched this family quietly decide who the cottage belongs to, based on who shows up loudest, who's photographed there most, who talks about it as already theirs. And I have to say something, that assumption has gotten very wrong." The smile vanished entirely. My father's hand slid off Nadine's shoulder. "What is this?" he said. Not even really a question anymore. Daniel kept reading. "The cottage was never meant to belong outright to any one person. Years ago, I placed the property and the surrounding 2 acres into a family trust, registered properly in Ontario, with conditions that I designed myself, with Daniel's help, and that I never told a single one of you about, because I wanted to see, honestly, who this place would matter to long after I was gone. Not who would say the right things at a dinner table." Murmurs broke out around the table, low and confused. Trevor leaned toward Nadine and whispered something I couldn't hear. She didn't answer him. "The trust," Daniel read, "fully activates the moment the keys are formally presented to any family member as a gift. Which, again, I understand has just happened. At that moment, full management authority, all decisions about the property, and legal trusteeship transfer automatically to the person I named as trustee 15 years ago, when this trust was first drafted." Nadine's arms had crossed over her chest. "Fine," she said, her voice climbing. "So who is it? Who's the trustee?" Daniel lowered the pages and looked, not at my mother, not at my father, but straight down the table at me. "Claire Whitfield." Nobody moved. The cicadas kept going outside like nothing had happened. My mother's mouth was actually open. My father looked at me like I'd shown up to dinner wearing a different face. Nadine laughed first, short, sharp, disbelieving. No. That has to be a mistake. Claire hasn't even been up here in 2 years." "I'm afraid it isn't a mistake," Daniel said quietly. "The paperwork was filed with a notary in Midland in 2010. I've kept a copy in our firm's vault ever since. Property records, trust documents, transfer authorizations. All of it activated electronically this afternoon, the moment your father registered the change of possession with the township for the keys handover." He reached into his bag a second time and pulled out a slim navy folder and walked it down the length of the table to set it in front of me. "Claire, I'll need you to review and sign these when you're ready. There's no rush tonight." I sat there with my hand resting flat on a folder that suddenly weighed about 40 pounds and felt every set of eyes at that table land on me at once. My father stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped. There has to be some kind of error here, Daniel. Walter would have told me if... He told me explicitly not to tell anyone, Daniel said, not unkindly. Including you, Richard. He was very clear that this needed to be a surprise. And that I wasn't to discuss the contents of the trust with any family member until it activated naturally, on its own terms, without anyone forcing the timeline. The whole porch had gone the kind of quiet you only get when an entire room is recalibrating everything it thought it knew. Nadine's eyes were wet, but not in the soft, grateful way they'd been 10 minutes earlier. Trevor had gone very still beside her, his phone, which had been recording the keys moment for Instagram, lowered and forgotten on the table. "Why?" Nadine said finally, her voice cracking. "Why would Grandpa do this? Why would he do this to me, in front of everyone, like this?" Daniel returned to the letter, found his place and read on. "I imagine some of you are upset right now, and I understand that. I want to be honest about why I made this choice. Nadine, you have a warm heart and you fill a room, and I have loved watching you raise your kids. But love for a place and responsibility for a place are two different things, and I needed to choose someone who had already proven, quietly, for years, that she shows up whether or not anyone's watching." Nobody at the table said a word. Claire balanced my books for me the last 3 summers I was alive, for free, without ever once mentioning it to the rest of the family. She drove up after her shifts to fix the dock pilings the year nobody else had time. She paid the property tax bill out of her own account in 2009 when I was short that fall and too proud to ask anyone, and never told a soul, including me. I only found out because I saw the bank's statement. She never once asked to be thanked for any of it. That's not an accident. That's a person you can trust with something that matters. I felt my throat close up. I remembered that fall, the property tax bill, sitting unopened on the cottage counter for weeks, my grandfather pretending it was a paperwork mix-up. I'd written the check from my checking account before I was even fully through my CPA articling, when $400 actually mattered to my budget, and never told anyone because telling people felt like asking for credit I didn't think I deserved. Nadine's face had crumpled. "This isn't fair," she said. I found my voice, finally, for the first time all evening. "It was never supposed to be fair," I said, and the whole table turned to look at me again. "It was supposed to be honest." Nobody answered that, not even Trevor. "I'm not taking this place away from anyone," I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking slightly, but steadying as I kept going. "Nobody's being locked out of the cottage. The kids can still come up every summer. You can still bring them up for the long weekend, Nad. None of that's changing." I looked at my mother, whose tears had gone from happy to something more complicated. "What's changing is that someone has to actually be responsible for this place. The insurance, the taxes, the roof that needs redoing in about 3 years, the dock that's one bad winter away from needing total replacement. Grandpa just decided that person should be me." My father sat back down slowly, like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. He looked at the keys still sitting in Nadine's open palm, then at the folder under my hand, and something in his face shifted. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that I could see. For the first time in maybe my whole life, my father actually looking at me and not through me. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "About the tax bill, about any of it." "I know," I said. "That was kind of the point." Daniel folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope, and set it gently on the table between us all, like something that needed to be handled carefully now that it had finished doing its work. The party didn't end loudly. Nobody stormed off the porch. Trevor poured himself another beer he didn't really want, just to have something to do with his hands. My mother cried, quietly, for a long time, and I think some of it was about my grandfather, and some of it was about 15 years of not noticing things she should have noticed. Nadine sat very still with the keys in her lap, not looking at them, not looking at anyone, until finally she stood up, walked the length of the table, and set them down in front of me without a word. It wasn't generous, exactly. It was more like she finally understood whose hand they belonged in. Later that night, after most of the family had gone to bed and the cottage had gone quiet, except for the water against the dock, I walked down to the end of it by myself, the way I used to with my grandfather, and sat with my feet hanging over the edge. The loons were calling somewhere out on the bay, the same sound I'd fallen asleep to every August of my childhood. I thought about the years I'd spent, assuming my place in this family was somewhere near the back of the room, useful but unannounced, and how my grandfather, it turned out, had been counting every single one of those quiet years like they mattered, even when nobody else was. Nadine came down and sat beside me eventually, not saying anything for a long time, just looking out at the water the way we used to as kids. "I really thought it was going to be ours," she said finally. "I know," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not upset. You don't have to." She was quiet again, picking at the hem of her sweater. "Will you actually let us keep coming up?" "Every summer," I said. "I mean it. I'm not him." I tipped my head toward the cottage, where my father's light was still on in the back bedroom. "I'm not interested in keeping score." She let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for longer than just that evening, and leaned her head briefly on my shoulder, the way she used to when we were small enough to share a bed during thunderstorms. The moon had come up fully over the bay by the time we went back inside, laying a long silver line across the water, all the way out to the point where my grandfather used to fish at dawn. I thought about him teaching me to fillet that pickerel, his hands loosely over mine, telling me not to fight the knife, just to let it do the work. He'd been doing the same thing to all of us for 15 years without any of us noticing, patiently, quietly, letting the truth find its own way to the surface in its own time, instead of forcing it. I locked up the cottage that night for the first time as the person responsible for it, checking the windows, dousing the porch light, turning the new set of keys over once in my palm before I set them on the hook by the back door. The same hook they'd hung on my whole childhood. For years, everyone in my family had assumed the cottage belonged to the daughter they noticed first. In the end, my grandfather left it to the one he'd actually been watching the whole time.